The crimson sunset over Detroit should have been beautiful, but Marcus Webb knew better than to trust the sky anymore. The former Marine stood atop the crumbling parking garage, binoculars pressed against his weathered face, watching the massive shadow that had been hovering over the city for the past 6 hours. The ship, if that's what anyone dared to call it, stretched across the horizon like a metallic storm cloud, its surface rippling with colors that hurt to look at directly. Marcus had served 2 tours overseas, survived firefights that turned grown men into trembling children, but nothing in his 42 years had prepared him for this moment. The radio on his hip crackled with desperate voices, emergency frequencies overwhelmed with panic, confusion, and the kind of fear that spreads faster than wildfire. Below him, the streets of downtown Detroit had transformed into rivers of fleeing humanity, cars abandoned at chaotic angles, people running without direction, driven only by the primal instinct to escape what they couldn't understand. The first pods fell at exactly 6:47 p.m. Marcus would remember that detail for the rest of his life, however long that might be. They descended like burning meteors, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, streaking through the darkening sky with trails of phosphorescent green. The impact tremors shook the parking structure beneath his boots, and he gripped the concrete ledge to steady himself. The pods struck throughout the city, crashing through office buildings, cratering intersections, plunging into the Detroit River with enormous geysers of steam. For a moment, everything went silent. The screaming stopped. The traffic noise ceased. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then the pods opened and the mist began to spread. It rolled out in thick, luminescent clouds, moving with purpose rather than drifting naturally, seeking, searching, consuming everything in its path. Marcus watched through his binoculars as the fog enveloped fleeing civilians on Woodward Avenue. They disappeared into the green haze, their silhouettes stumbling, falling, vanishing completely. When the first ones emerged from the mist, Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. They had been human minutes ago. He recognized a woman in a business suit, a teenager in a basketball jersey, an elderly man with a walking cane he no longer needed. But they moved wrong now, their joints bending at unnatural angles, their heads twitching with insect-like movements. Their eyes had turned completely white, glowing with an inner luminescence that matched the alien fog. The infection spread with terrifying speed. The transformed attacked the uninfected with mindless fury, and those who fell rose again within minutes, adding to the growing horde. Marcus grabbed his radio, switching to the emergency military frequency he still had access to. The voice that answered was young, panicked, barely maintaining composure. The National Guard was mobilizing, but they were overwhelmed, unprepared for an enemy that turned casualties into reinforcements. Marcus made his decision in seconds. His apartment was only 3 blocks away and his go-bag was ready. Old habits from the Marines died hard. But between him and safety, the streets were filling with the infected, their numbers doubling every minute. He descended the parking garage stairs 2 at a time, his hand instinctively reaching for the Glock he kept holstered beneath his jacket. The ground floor was chaos incarnate. A security guard Marcus recognized from his morning coffee runs was hunched over something that had once been human, and when the man looked up, his transformed white eyes locked onto Marcus with predatory focus. Marcus ran. He burst through the emergency exit into the alley, the cool evening air thick with screams and the sound of shattering glass. Above, the alien ship pulsed with light, and Marcus realized with growing horror that this wasn't an invasion in the traditional sense. The aliens weren't landing troops or demanding surrender. They were reshaping humanity itself, remaking the world's population into something else entirely. As he sprinted toward his apartment building, weaving between abandoned cars and leaping over scattered debris, Marcus passed a storefront with television still broadcasting in the window. Every screen showed the same scene repeated across the globe. Alien ships over major cities, the green mist spreading, civilization collapsing in real time. A reporter in New York was mid-sentence when the feed cut to static. London was burning. Tokyo had gone dark. Then Marcus saw something that made him stop despite the danger closing in around him. On one screen, a news helicopter captured footage of the aliens' own pods being overrun by the creatures they had created. The infected weren't just attacking humans anymore. They were attacking everything that moved, including the tall, angular figures that emerged from smaller craft, figures that were unmistakably alien. The pathogen had evolved beyond its creator's control, and now 3 forces occupied Earth, humanity, the aliens, and the growing army of the transformed that threatened to consume them both. 3 days after the sky bled red, Marcus Webb had learned that survival meant making impossible choices every hour. The apartment building he'd fortified on the outskirts of Detroit now sheltered 17 people, 18 if you counted the barely conscious man they'd pulled from an overturned ambulance that morning. Marcus stood guard at the second-floor window, watching the street below where a pack of the infected tore apart something he chose not to identify. The creatures had changed since that first night. They moved faster now, showed rudimentary problem-solving skills, and worst of all, they seemed to be communicating with each other through strange clicking sounds that echoed through the empty streets. Behind him, Jennifer Martinez was rationing their dwindling water supply while her 10-year-old son, Danny, sat in the corner trying to make a battery-powered radio pick up any signal that wasn't screaming or static. The boy's father hadn't made it past the first night, torn apart while holding the convenience store door closed so his family could escape through the back. Jennifer hadn't cried once since then, her grief transformed into a steel determination that Marcus recognized from his years in combat. The group's other members represented a cross-section of humanity thrown together by catastrophe. There was Thomas Briggs, a former construction worker whose knowledge of building structures had helped them reinforce their shelter. Angela Foster, a nurse whose medical supplies and expertise had already saved 3 lives. Elderly William Patterson, a Korean War veteran who could still shoot straight and never complain despite his arthritis. A college student named Kyle Richardson who'd proven surprisingly resourceful at scavenging. Each person carried their own trauma, their own losses, but they functioned as a unit because the alternative was death or worse. Marcus had established rules that everyone followed without question. Stay quiet, stay alert, never go anywhere alone, and if someone got bitten they had 10 minutes to say goodbye before the inevitable. They'd already enforced that last rule twice, and each time it carved something essential out of Marcus's soul. The discovery came on the afternoon of the 3rd day when Angela returned from a medicine run to the pharmacy 4 blocks away, her face pale and hands shaking. She'd seen them, she reported breathlessly, the aliens or what was left of them. A group of 6, barricaded inside a bank vault, fighting off infected that had somehow learned to operate door handles. The aliens were dying, she said, their strange blue blood splattered across marble floors, their advanced weapons barely holding back the relentless assault. Marcus made the decision to investigate despite the risks, taking Thomas and Kyle with him, moving through the devastated streets using the paths they'd mapped out over 3 days of careful observation. The bank was a war zone. Infected bodies lay scattered across the lobby, killed by weapons that left cauterized wounds and the smell of ozone in the air. The vault door stood partially open, and inside, 3 aliens remained alive, their tall frames hunched in exhaustion, their large black eyes tracking the humans with what might have been fear. Marcus raised his empty hands slowly, making his intentions clear. One of the aliens, its skin a pale gray marked with bioluminescent patterns, made a sound like grinding metal and tapped at a device on its wrist. A holographic display appeared, crude images forming a basic communication. The message was clear enough. The pathogen was meant to make humans docile, compliant, ready for peaceful assimilation into their empire. But something had gone catastrophically wrong. The virus had mutated upon contact with human biology, creating something the aliens never intended, something that saw all living things as enemies. The infected were spreading across the planet, overwhelming military installations, consuming population centers, growing stronger with each passing hour. The aliens' own command ship had been breached, their leadership likely dead or transformed, their technology useless against an enemy that felt no fear and couldn't be reasoned with. Meanwhile, across the city in the remains of Wayne State University, Dr. Rebecca Stone worked by the light of a generator-powered lamp in what used to be her research laboratory. The molecular biologist had spent 72 hours analyzing blood samples from the infected, surviving on coffee and determination. What she discovered terrified her more than the creatures shambling through the streets outside. The pathogen wasn't just reanimating dead tissue, it was rewriting human DNA at a fundamental level, creating a new form of life that retained fragments of memory and intelligence. The infected were evolving, adapting, learning. Her microscope showed cellular structures that shouldn't exist, a fusion of human biology and something utterly alien. Rebecca's hands trembled as she documented her findings, knowing that somewhere out there, people needed this information to survive. She'd lost contact with the CDC, with the military, with every official channel. But she kept working because that's what scientists did when the world ended. They searched for answers even when the questions were apocalyptic. Outside her barricaded laboratory, she heard the clicking sounds growing louder, more complex, almost like language, and she realized with cold certainty that humanity's time as Earth's dominant species might be measured in days rather than years. The alien's name was impossible for human vocal cords to pronounce, but the translation device rendered it as Zekthor, and that was close enough for Marcus Webb. The scout had crash-landed 2 blocks from their shelter when his escape pod malfunctioned, carving a burning trench through what used to be a community park. Marcus found him at dawn on the 4th day, pinned beneath twisted metal, his elongated leg bent at an angle that looked wrong even for alien anatomy. The infected were closing in, drawn by the crash's noise, and Marcus had perhaps 90 seconds to make a choice that would define everything that followed. He chose mercy over fear, signaling Thomas and Kyle to help extract the wounded alien while he provided covering fire. The Glock barked 3 times, dropping the nearest infected, but Marcus knew the sound would draw more. They hauled Zekthor back to the apartment building with infected pouring from side streets, Jennifer holding the door open while Angela already prepared her makeshift medical station, her nurse's instincts overriding any prejudice about treating non-human patients. Zekthor's recovery took 6 hours, his alien physiology responding to basic wound care supplemented by a silver gel he produced from his equipment pack. When consciousness returned to his large, dark eyes, he didn't show gratitude or relief, he showed shame. Through the translation device, speaking in a voice that sounded like wine through crystal caves, Zekthor told them everything. His people, the Krevnash, had catalogued Earth for decades, studying humanity with clinical detachment. They deemed humans too violent, too chaotic for standard diplomatic contact, but valuable enough as a species to be preserved and integrated into their galactic collective. The pathogen was called the Harmonizer, used successfully on 47 other worlds to pacify aggressive populations, making them suggestible and compliant while maintaining their core identities. It had never failed before Earth, never produced anything like the ravenous creatures that now threatened to consume the planet. Zekthor explained that human neurochemistry, particularly the adrenal response and the complexity of Earth's diverse genetic pool, had caused a catastrophic mutation. The Harmonizer had bonded with something primal in human DNA, something his people's scientists never anticipated. The infected weren't mindless. That was the revelation that sent ice through Marcus's veins. They were forming a collective intelligence, each transformed human adding their memories and knowledge to a growing hive consciousness. The clicking sounds were communication, coordination, the sound of a new species learning to think as one. Zekthor showed them footage from his pod sensors, images of infected forming organized groups, setting ambushes, even using simple tools. In New York, they'd collapsed a bridge to trap fleeing survivors. In Los Angeles, they'd driven a fuel truck into a military barricade with devastating precision. The creatures weren't just spreading, they were strategizing. Worse still, the infected showed no discrimination in their targets. Zekthor revealed recordings of the main Krevnash command ship, a vessel 3 miles long, being overrun from the inside. The Harmonizer had been stored there, and when containment failed, it had spread through the alien crew with the same horrifying efficiency it showed with humans. The ship had crashed somewhere in the Atlantic, taking thousands of Krevnash lives and stranding the remaining forces on Earth without leadership or hope of reinforcement. Marcus listened to all of this while watching the street below, where infected had begun to gather in unusual numbers, standing motionless as if waiting for orders that would eventually come. He thought about the impossible situation they faced, caught between an alien presence that had meant to enslave humanity peacefully and the monstrous result of that failed plan. The enemy of my enemy, he thought, remembering the old saying from his military days. When Zekthor finished speaking, the apartment fell silent except for Danny's quiet breathing and the distant clicking of the infected. It was William Patterson, the old Korean War veteran, who spoke first, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension. He'd fought enemies before, he said, and he'd learned that survival sometimes meant working with people you'd never have chosen as allies. The question wasn't whether they could trust the aliens, it was whether they could afford not to. Jennifer nodded slowly, her hand resting protectively on Danny's shoulder. Angela checked Zekthor's bandages with professional detachment. Thomas and Kyle exchanged glances that spoke of reluctant agreement. Marcus made the decision that would reshape their struggle for survival. They would work with Zekthor, share information, combine their strengths against the growing infected hordes. But first they needed to find others. Other survivors, other Krevnash, anyone with knowledge or resources. Zekthor mentioned a human scientist broadcasting on scrambled frequencies, someone conducting research on the pathogen. Dr. Rebecca Stone, the transmissions had identified her, working from somewhere in the university district. Marcus checked his ammunition, counted their supplies, and began planning their most dangerous journey yet. Outside, the infected had begun to move again, but this time with purpose, forming columns that marched toward some unknown destination. The hive was awakening, and humanity's last chance for survival meant trusting the very beings who had triggered the apocalypse. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus as he loaded his weapon and prepared to venture into a city that belonged increasingly to neither human nor alien, but to something terrifyingly new. The journey to Wayne State University took 4 hours to cover what should have been a 15-minute drive, and it cost them nearly everything. Marcus led the team through the skeletal remains of Detroit, moving through buildings rather than streets, using the path of least resistance that Zekthor's scanning equipment identified. The aliens' technology could detect infected concentrations through walls, showing heat signatures that pulsed with an eerie synchronization, as if the creatures shared a single heartbeat. Their group had been forced to leave most of the survivors behind, taking only those essential for the mission. Jennifer insisted on coming despite Marcus's objections, arguing that someone needed to document their findings if they didn't make it back. Thomas brought his practical skills and steady nerves. Angela carried medical supplies and hope. Kyle, surprisingly, had convinced them he could operate Krevnash technology after watching Zekthor for just 2 days, his computer science background translating across species. William stayed behind to protect the others, his last words to Marcus a simple command to not waste the opportunity they'd been given. They found Dr. Rebecca Stone barricaded in a laboratory that smelled of chemicals and desperation, surrounded by enough scientific equipment to outfit a small research facility. She'd been surviving on canned food and collecting rainwater from the roof, her rifle propped against the desk where she worked 18-hour days trying to understand the enemy that had destroyed civilization. When Marcus's group broke through her barricade, she nearly shot Thomas before recognizing they were human. Her reaction to Zekthor was more complex, a mixture of scientific fascination and barely controlled rage at meeting a member of the species responsible for Earth's downfall. But Rebecca was a scientist before anything else, and when Zekthor offered access to Krevnash biological databases, her anger transformed into focused collaboration. What they discovered in the next 2 hours changed everything. Rebecca's research, combined with Zekthor's knowledge of the original harmonizer pathogen, painted a picture more terrifying than anyone had imagined. The infected weren't just evolving, they were accelerating their evolution at a rate that defied natural selection. Each generation of infected, which emerged roughly every 48 hours, showed significant improvements over the last. Rebecca pulled up her recordings, footage captured by security cameras still operating on backup power throughout the city. The early infected had been shambling, disorganized, driven by basic predatory instincts. The second-generation infected moved with greater coordination, hunted in packs, showed primitive problem-solving abilities. But the third-generation specimens that had appeared just yesterday were something else entirely. They ran with the speed of Olympic athletes, climbed buildings with insect-like agility, and demonstrated intelligence that approached human baseline. Rebecca had watched them on camera setting traps, using infected as bait to draw out survivors, even avoiding areas where they'd previously taken casualties. Zekthor analyzed the data with growing alarm, his bioluminescent patterns flickering rapidly in what his translation device indicated was extreme distress. The harmonizer had been designed to rewrite neural pathways, he explained, but it was meant to simplify them, not enhance them. Something in human DNA was causing the opposite effect, creating a feedback loop where each infected retained fragments of their original intelligence and added it to the collective. The hive mind wasn't just controlling the infected, it was learning from them, growing smarter with every human it consumed. Marcus absorbed this information while watching the street below, where a group of infected stood in perfect formation, their movements synchronized like a military drill. These weren't the stumbling corpses from horror movies. These were predators evolving in real time, adapting to overcome any obstacle humanity or the Krevnash could present. The meeting that followed was part war council, part scientific conference, and part desperate gamble. Zekthor revealed that 6 other Krevnash survivors had established a base in the ruins of the Detroit Metro Airport, where they'd managed to get limited communications working. They'd been trying to reach the Krevnash fleet in orbit, but the command ship's crash had severed the connection protocols. However, they had weapons technology and most importantly, they had a partial schematic of the harmonizer's structure. Rebecca proposed a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal, and Marcus couldn't decide which. If they could capture an evolved infected specimen intact and analyze its neural structure, they might find a weakness in the hive connection. Break that connection, and the infected might revert to mindless automatons, or better yet, the transformation might be reversible. Jennifer recorded everything, her camera documenting the moment when humanity and the Krevnash formally agreed to work together, not as friends but as survivors facing extinction. Thomas began sketching out defensive positions, his construction experience applied to building fortifications that could withstand evolved infected. Angela and Zekthor discussed alien medical technology that might protect against infection. Kyle studied Krevnash weapon systems with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found purpose in apocalypse. Outside, the clicking sounds grew more complex, almost like sentences now, and Rebecca's monitoring equipment showed infected populations moving with coordinated purpose toward major infrastructure. They were taking territory, establishing control, building something that looked disturbingly like civilization. Marcus checked his watch and realized they'd been at the university for 3 hours, which meant William and the others back at the apartment were vulnerable, exposed, waiting for a return that might never come. The alliance was formed, humanity and alien united against their own creation, but the infected were evolving faster than either species could adapt, and somewhere in the ruins of human civilization, the hive mind was planning its next move with an intelligence that grew more formidable with each passing hour. The trip from Detroit to Chicago took 5 days, and every mile revealed a world transforming into something alien and hostile. Marcus Webb led a convoy of 3 vehicles, 2 military Humvees salvaged from an overrun National Guard depot and a Krevnash transport that hovered 3 feet off the ground and moved in complete silence. Their group had grown to 37 people, absorbing survivors from 3 different settlements along the route, each with stories of settlements falling and infected growing more sophisticated. At the metro airport, they'd found not 6 but 14 Krevnash survivors, led by a warrior-class alien named Torvan who initially wanted to execute Zekthor for collaborating with humans. That confrontation had nearly turned violent until Rebecca Stone stepped between them with data that stopped everyone cold. Her analysis showed that the infected were converging on major cities, specifically targeting underground infrastructure, and the largest concentration was beneath Chicago where something massive was being constructed in the old subway tunnels and basement levels of collapsed skyscrapers. Satellite imagery retrieved from a still-functioning military database that Kyle had hacked into showed heat signatures forming patterns too organized to be random, structures being built with purpose and disturbing efficiency. Marcus studied those images during the journey, watching the patterns shift and grow, and he recognized what he was seeing because he'd seen it before in Afghanistan: fortifications, defensive positions, supply routes. The infected weren't just surviving, they were establishing a base of operations, and that meant the hive mind had evolved beyond animal instinct into genuine strategic thinking. Jennifer documented everything with her camera, creating a record that she transmitted to every working frequency, hoping someone somewhere was still listening and learning from their discoveries. Thomas worked with Krevnash engineers to modify human weapons, creating hybrid technology that combined Earth's kinetic firepower with alien energy systems. Angela trained a team of medics, both human and Krevnash, sharing knowledge across species because casualties were inevitable and survival meant adapting faster than the enemy. Danny, Jennifer's son, had become the group's messenger, his small size and quick reflexes making him perfect for moving through tight spaces. And Marcus hated that a 10-year-old had become essential to military operations but couldn't argue with results. They reached Chicago's outskirts on day 5 and found a city that had stopped being human. The infected had transformed entire neighborhoods into organic-looking structures, using materials scavenged from collapsed buildings to create hive extensions that pulsed with bioluminescent veins. The clicking sounds here were constant, layered, complex as symphony orchestras, and Rebecca's equipment registered communication patterns that showed information density matching human language. They established a forward base in an elevated train station that gave them tactical overview of the downtown area, and what they saw through scopes and scanning equipment made even Torvan's hardened warriors show fear. The infected numbered in the hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, moving through the streets in organized groups, each with specific tasks. Some were builders, constructing the strange organic architecture that spread like fungus across steel and concrete. Others were hunters, ranging out in coordinated packs to bring back resources and new victims. A third group appeared to be guards, posted at regular intervals with sight lines that suggested someone understood military tactics. But it was what lay beneath the city that drew them forward despite every survival instinct screaming to run. Zekthor's deep scanning equipment penetrated hundreds of feet underground, revealing a chamber network so extensive it had to have been worked on since the first day of infection. At the center, approximately 300 feet beneath what used to be Millennium Park, something enormous pulsed with energy that registered on both human and Krevnash sensors. Rebecca theorized it was a neural nexus, the physical manifestation of the hive mind, the central processing unit controlling millions of infected across potentially the entire continent. If they could destroy it, they might shatter the collective consciousness, but reaching it meant descending into territory so saturated with infected that the mission was effectively suicide. Marcus volunteered immediately, selecting a strike team of 10 humans including himself, Rebecca, Thomas, and Jennifer who refused to stay behind, plus 10 Krevnash including Zekthor and Torvan. They would go in fast, plant Krevnash demolition charges with enough yield to vaporize the Nexus and everything within a 100-yard radius, and extract before the hive could respond. The infiltration began at midnight when infected activity patterns showed a slight decrease based on 3 days of observation. They entered through a collapsed parking garage, descending into darkness lit only by bioluminescent growths that pulsed in rhythm with the clicking sounds echoing through stone corridors. The infected had transformed the underground into something that looked more grown than built, walls covered in organic material that felt warm to the touch, almost alive. They encountered the first guards 20 minutes in, infected that moved with military precision, patrolling in pairs with overlapping fields of vision. Marcus took them down with suppressed weapons, but he knew each kill was being felt by the hive, information traveling through the collective that intruders had breached their territory. They pushed deeper, following Zekthor's scanner toward the Nexus, and the temperature increased with each level they descended, the air growing thick with moisture and a sweet rotten smell that made breathing difficult. Then they reached the chamber, and what Marcus saw there would haunt him forever. A cathedral-sized space filled with infected standing motionless in concentric circles around a central mass of writhing tissue and bone, a structure built from thousands of bodies fused together into a single pulsing brain, and in that moment before the hive fully awakened to their presence, Marcus realized they hadn't been building a base or a fortress, they'd been building a womb and something inside it was about to be born. The Nexus awakened with a sound like 1,000 voices screaming in harmony, and the chamber erupted into chaos. The infected surrounding the massive pulsing structure moved as one, turning toward Marcus's strike team with perfect synchronization, their white eyes blazing with intelligence and fury. Marcus opened fire, his rifle cutting down the nearest infected, but for every one that fell, 3 more emerged from passages he hadn't seen in the darkness. Torvan roared commands in his native language, his warriors forming a defensive perimeter while Zekthor rushed forward with the demolition charges, desperately trying to reach the Nexus before the swarm overwhelmed them. Rebecca provided cover fire, her hands steady despite the horror surrounding them, her scientific mind still cataloging details even as survival became increasingly impossible. Thomas fought beside 2 Krevnash engineers, buying seconds with each pull of the trigger, and Jennifer documented everything because if they failed, someone needed to know what happened here beneath Chicago, in the cathedral where humanity's replacement was being born. The first casualty came within 30 seconds. A Krevnash warrior named Velkris took a hit meant for Kyle, 3 infected tearing into him with enhanced strength that ripped through alien armor like paper. His death scream echoed through the chamber, and Marcus watched the warrior's bioluminescent patterns fade to black as alien blood pooled on organic floor that seemed to absorb it hungrily. Kyle stumbled backward, his face splattered with blue blood, and Thomas grabbed him before shock could turn into paralysis, shoving a weapon into the young man's hands and shouting that grieving was a luxury for people who survived. The infected pressed closer, and Marcus realized they weren't just attacking randomly, they were specifically targeting anyone approaching the Nexus, protecting their precious creation with coordinated defense that spoke of military strategy. Zekthor made it within 20 feet before a wave of infected cut him off, forcing him to drop back or be overwhelmed, the demolition charges still clutched in his 3-fingered hands. Then the thing in the Nexus moved, and Marcus understood why the hive was so desperate to protect it. Through gaps in the fused tissue, he saw something unfurling, a form that was neither human nor Krevnash but a nightmare fusion of both species. It had the size and strength of alien physiology combined with human adaptability, its skin shifting between gray and flesh-toned as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The eyes that opened across its surface glowed with terrible awareness, and when it spoke, the voice came from everywhere at once, resonating through the chamber and directly into Marcus's mind. The hive called itself Legion, spoke with the combined knowledge of millions of absorbed consciousnesses, and it told them they were witnessing evolution's next step, the birth of a species that would inherit Earth and eventually spread to the stars. Humanity's violence and Krevnash technology merged through the harmonizer into something superior to both, something that would never know division or conflict because it thought with a single perfect mind. Marcus made the decision in a heartbeat, the same instinct that had kept him alive through 2 wars. He couldn't reach the Nexus, but he could create an opening for someone who could. He signaled to Torvan, a gesture that needed no translation, and the Krevnash commander understood immediately what Marcus intended. The old Marine charged directly at the densest concentration of infected, screaming to draw their attention, firing on full automatic and throwing his last grenades into their ranks. The hive responded exactly as he'd predicted, diverting infected to stop him, creating a gap in their defensive formation. Torvan and 2 of his warriors exploited that gap, their alien speed carrying them past Marcus's position in a blur of motion. Zekthor followed, the demolition charges armed and counting down from 60 seconds. They reached the Nexus, planted the explosives at its base, and the thing that called itself Legion shrieked with rage and something that might have been fear. The retreat should have been impossible, but desperation gave them speed and fury gave them strength. Marcus fought his way back to the main group, his rifle empty, switching to his Glock and then to the Krevnash energy weapon Thomas threw him when even that ran dry. Angela went down covering their withdrawal, an infected pack overwhelming her position, and her last act was detonating a grenade that took a dozen of the creatures with her into oblivion. Jennifer screamed her name but kept moving, kept filming because Angela had died to buy them time and wasting that sacrifice was unthinkable. They hit the stairs running, infected pouring after them in a wave of bodies and fury, the demolition charges ticking down. 40 seconds. Thomas carried a wounded Krevnash warrior, refusing to leave anyone behind despite the weight slowing him down. 30 seconds. They reached the parking garage level and Kyle slammed the emergency door shut, jamming it with a metal beam that bought them precious moments. 20 seconds. They burst into open air, the night sky above Chicago stained orange from fires burning across the city. The explosion came at 0, a shockwave that collapsed buildings and sent a pillar of flame erupting from subway entrances across 3 city blocks. Marcus felt the heat wash over him, felt the ground shake like an earthquake, and for a moment he thought they'd actually won. Then the clicking sound started again, coming from every direction, and he realized the Nexus might be destroyed but hundreds of thousands of infected remained, and now they were angry. The survivors formed a defensive circle in the street, their ammunition critically low, their numbers reduced to barely 27. They'd struck the first real blow against the hive, but the war was far from over, and Marcus looked at the faces around him, human and Krevnash, allies forged in fire, and wondered if any of them would live to see dawn. Above them, the remaining Krevnash orbital ships that had stayed hidden chose that moment to reveal themselves, their weapons firing on infected concentrations throughout the city, and Marcus realized the battle for Chicago had just become a war for Earth's future, fought on 3 fronts with stakes that couldn't possibly be higher. The bombardment from the Krevnash orbital ships bought them exactly 11 minutes before the infected adapted, learning to scatter and take cover in ways that minimized casualties from aerial attacks. Marcus Webb used every second, rallying the survivors into a fighting retreat toward the extraction point 3 blocks north where dropships were descending through smoke and fire. The destruction of the Nexus had damaged the hive mind but not destroyed it, and what remained was angry, coordinated, and closing in from every direction. Rebecca ran beside him, her laptop clutched against her chest containing data worth more than any of their lives, research that might represent humanity's last chance for a cure. Jennifer kept Danny close, the boy's camera still recording even as his mother fired her rifle one-handed, documenting humanity's desperate last stand. Thomas and Kyle worked together placing charges at intersections, collapsing buildings to slow the infected tide, buying minutes with explosives while Krevnash warriors laid down covering fire with weapons that turned night into day. They lost 6 more people in those 11 minutes. Good people whose names Marcus burned into his memory because someone needed to remember them when this was over, if it ever was. They reached the extraction point with infected closing to within 50 yards, the dropships hovering above street level, their loading ramps extended like salvation made of metal. Torvan stood at the ramp of the lead ship, his warrior's honor demanding he be the last aboard, and Marcus respected him enough to not argue about who would hold the final position. They loaded the wounded first, then the civilians, then the soldiers, both human and Krevnash, and Marcus was about to board when Zekthor grabbed his arm with surprising strength. The alien scanner was showing something impossible, something that changed everything. Deep beneath the city, in chambers they hadn't reached, were humans still alive, still themselves, encased in organic pods that were slowly transforming them. The hive hadn't just been creating soldiers. It had been storing victims for gradual conversion, keeping their consciousness intact during the process, and Rebecca's data suggested the transformation might be reversible if they could synthesize an inhibitor fast enough. The choice Marcus faced in that moment was impossible. They could evacuate now, save the people they had, retreat to fight another day with the knowledge that thousands of humans were trapped in the hive's nurseries. Or they could go back into hell with almost no ammunition, exhausted soldiers and slim odds of survival, gambling everything on a chance to save people who might already be too far gone. He looked at the faces around him and saw the same calculation playing out in their eyes. Thomas was already checking his weapon, his jaw set in determination that said he wasn't leaving anyone behind if there was any chance. Rebecca was frantically calculating on her laptop, working out how much time the pods bought them, how long before transformation became irreversible. Jennifer held Danny tight, and Marcus saw her wrestling with the impossible math of risking her life when her son needed her, balanced against the knowledge that other parents' children were dying below. The decision came from an unexpected source. Torvan stepped forward and declared that the Krevnash had caused this catastrophe, and Honor demanded they be the ones to pay the price for fixing it. His warriors would go into the depths, retrieve the pods and hold the infected back while the humans escaped with Rebecca's research. It was a suicide mission delivered with calm certainty, and Marcus started to protest before understanding filled him. This was how the Krevnash sought redemption, not through apologies or treaties, but through sacrifice that might balance the scales of what they'd done to Earth. Zekthor stayed behind despite Torvan's orders, declaring that he'd lived with shame long enough and preferred to die with honor beside his commander. They clasped arms in the Krevnash tradition, and Marcus saw genuine friendship cross the species barrier. The dropships lifted off with the human survivors, and Marcus watched through the viewport as Torvan led his warriors back into the inferno, moving toward underground access points while infected swarmed from every direction. The Krevnash fought like legends, their weapons carving paths through the horde, buying minutes with alien blood and warriors' courage. They reached the pod chambers according to scanner data, began extracting the victims with precision and speed, and for a moment it looked like they might actually succeed. Then the hive sent everything it had, waves of infected that crashed against the Krevnash position like a tsunami of teeth and fury. Torvan's last transmission was simple, telling the orbital ships to fire on his position, to burn out the chamber network and give the infection no more raw materials to work with. The weapons platforms complied, and downtown Chicago became a crematorium that consumed infected hive structures, and heroes alike in cleansing fire that could be seen from orbit. 3 months later, Marcus stood on the observation deck of the Krevnash colony ship that orbited Earth, looking down at a planet slowly healing from wounds that had nearly killed it. The bombardment of major infected concentrations had worked, breaking the hive's ability to coordinate on a massive scale. Pockets of infected remained, but they were disorganized, manageable, no longer the existential threat they'd been. Rebecca's research had produced an inhibitor that stopped the transformation if administered within 72 hours of infection, and the production facilities were finally coming online. Humanity numbered perhaps 200 million worldwide, down from 8 billion, but those who remained were survivors, harder and wiser for what they'd endured. The Krevnash fleet had committed to staying, to helping rebuild, to earning forgiveness through generations of service rather than demanding it through words. Jennifer's footage had been broadcast across every surviving human settlement and to the Krevnash homeworld, creating a shared history of tragedy and unlikely alliance. Danny was learning Krevnash technology in their schools, part of a generation that would grow up knowing aliens as protectors rather than invaders. Thomas was leading construction efforts in what would become New Detroit, building with both human and alien techniques to create something stronger than either species could achieve alone. Kyle had become a liaison between human and Krevnash technical teams, his quick mind bridging the gap between worlds. Marcus thought about all they'd lost: Angela's steady hands, William's wise counsel, Torvan's warrior's honor, Zekthor's redemptive sacrifice, and millions whose names would never be recorded but whose lives mattered just as much. Earth would never be the same world it had been before the sky bled red, but perhaps that wasn't entirely bad. Humanity had learned it wasn't alone in the universe, had faced extinction and survived, had found common ground with aliens despite catastrophic first contact. The scars would take generations to heal, and the infected zones would remain dangerous for years, but for the first time since that terrible evening in Detroit, Marcus allowed himself to feel something that wasn't just grim determination. He felt hope. The future would be different, built on ruins and watered with tears, but it would be a future nonetheless, shared between species who'd learned that survival sometimes meant setting aside hatred to face a common threat. As dawn broke over the eastern seaboard, painting the clouds in shades of gold and amber, Marcus Webb smiled and thought that maybe, just maybe, Earth's fate didn't hang in the balance anymore. The balance had been struck, paid for in blood and sacrifice, and the world that emerged from chaos would be one worth fighting for, worth building, worth passing on to children who would never fully understand how close it had all come to ending. The war was over, and against impossible odds, life had won.